There's a particular kind of silence that only appears when you're surrounded by people, not the absence of sound, not awkward quiet. It's the feeling of being inside a room full of voices and realizing none of them are actually reaching you. You're laughing at the right moments. You're nodding when it's expected. You're reacting just enough to stay included. And yet something inside you is slightly behind the moment, like you're watching everything through a thin sheet of glass. No one would guess this by looking at you. That's the strange part. From the outside, it seems like you belong. You're present. You're engaged. You're part of the group. But internally, there's a faint pull backward, a quiet withdrawal that happens without effort, without decision. It doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't feel sad in the way sadness is usually described. It feels empty in a specific way, almost neutral, almost calm. And that's what makes it unsettling, because loneliness is supposed to feel loud, heavy, obvious. But this isn't loud. This is subtle. This is sitting at a table with people you know well and feeling like you're slightly misaligned with the moment everyone else is in. This is realizing you could leave early and no one would feel the shift you feel internally every time you stay too long. This is noticing how often you're the observer in social spaces, even when you're actively participating. And if you're honest, you've felt this way for a long time, not just with strangers, not just in unfamiliar environments, even with people you care about, even with people who care about you, which raises a quiet question most people never ask themselves. How can someone feel alone without being isolated? How can connection exist on the surface while something underneath remains untouched? Most people assume loneliness comes from not being included. But what if inclusion isn't the problem? What if the real issue has nothing to do with how many people are around you? There's a moment that happens in groups where conversation shifts from light to something more real. Someone shares a personal thought. A vulnerability slips out. The atmosphere changes just slightly. Most people lean into that moment. But you don't lean forward, you pause. Not because you don't care, not because you don't understand, but because something in you hesitates before stepping fully into shared emotional space. It's almost automatic, like your system learned long ago that being present doesn't always mean being safe. So instead of moving closer, you become quieter, not visibly, internally. You listen more, you feel more, you say less, and afterward people describe you as thoughtful, calm, deep. They don't realize that what they're noticing is distance, not distance from them, distance from the center of the room. There's another strange thing that happens. You can feel other people's moods instantly. The energy of the group hits you all at once. Excitement, tension, insecurity, competition, pretending. It's not overwhelming exactly. It's layered, like hearing too many frequencies at the same time. So while everyone else is riding the surface of the interaction, you're processing something much denser underneath. And that creates separation, not because you want to be separate, but because depth and surface don't move at the same speed. You've probably noticed how quickly you get tired in groups, even enjoyable ones. Not physically tired, socially tired. It's not the talking that drains you, it's the constant adjustment, matching tone, reading shifts, sensing unspoken things. By the time you leave, you feel like you've been holding your breath without realizing it. And when you're finally alone again, your body relaxes, not in relief, in familiarity. That's when another question sneaks in. Why does being alone feel more natural than being surrounded? Why does solitude feel grounding while groups feel disorienting? Most people would say it's introversion. But that explanation feels too shallow, because introversion doesn't explain the emotional distance you feel even when you're engaged. It doesn't explain why you can feel closer to someone in silence than in conversation. It doesn't explain why you crave connection but struggle to feel met by it. There's also the guilt, the quiet guilt you carry after social gatherings. You replay moments, not because you said something wrong, but because you wonder if you were fully there, if you were present enough, warm enough, open enough. You question whether the distance others don't notice is actually something you should fix. And yet, when you imagine forcing yourself to be more involved, more expressive, more outwardly connected, something in you resists. Not fear, instinct, as if you know on some level that pushing yourself closer too quickly leads to a kind of internal fragmentation, like you lose something important when you overextend socially. So instead, you hover, connected but not immersed, included but not absorbed. This pattern didn't start in adulthood, it just became more visible there. If you trace it back, you might remember moments from earlier in life when you learned to stay slightly on the outside, times when being fully open didn't lead to understanding, times when sharing too much made things heavier, not lighter, times when you realized that people don't always know what to do with emotional depth, so you adapted, not consciously, quietly. You learned to bring just enough of yourself into shared spaces, enough to belong, not enough to be exposed. And over time, that became your default. The strange part is that people often feel comfortable around you. They open up easily. They talk freely. You hold space without effort. But rarely does anyone ask how you're actually experiencing the moment. Because you don't look lonely, you don't look disconnected, you look composed. And composure is often mistaken for fulfillment, but composure can also be a shield, not a wall, a filter, one that lets certain things through while keeping the core untouched. There's a subtle grief that comes with this. Not dramatic grief, quiet grief, the kind that shows up as a vague sense that something meaningful is always just out of reach, that even in moments of laughter and shared experiences, there's a part of you standing slightly apart, observing instead of merging. You don't resent people for this. You don't blame them. You blame yourself sometimes. You wonder if you're too sensitive, too deep, too internally focused. But that explanation doesn't fully satisfy either, because you're not detached from people. You're detached inside people's spaces, and those are not the same thing. What's happening here is not social failure. It's not emotional coldness, and it's definitely not a lack of desire for connection. Something else is at work, something quieter, something learned, something that doesn't announce itself as loneliness, but produces loneliness as a side effect. And here's where things get uncomfortable. Because what you're experiencing in groups isn't absence, it's containment, a form of self-holding that developed long before you had words for it, a way of staying intact while still participating. Most people assume closeness is about proximity, but for you, closeness has always been about safety, and safety was never guaranteed just because people were present. So you learn to stay aware, to stay slightly back, to keep your internal world protected, even while sharing the external one. But this adaptation has a cost, and that cost is the specific kind of loneliness that only appears when you're surrounded, the kind that makes you feel invisible in plain sight, the kind that makes you wonder why being seen doesn't always feel like being known. And the most confusing part, you don't know how to explain this to anyone. Because on paper, your life looks connected, social, engaged, normal. So you stay quiet about the quiet. You don't want to sound ungrateful or dramatic or disconnected from reality. So you carry it internally. And over time, that internal distance becomes familiar, comfortable even, which is where the real shift begins. Because what feels like a personality trait may actually be a psychological adaptation. And what looks like loneliness in groups may be something far more intentional than you think. But that realization doesn't come easily. It arrives slowly. And it changes the way you see yourself in every room you've ever been in. At some point, usually without a clear moment of decision, you start to notice something unsettling. The loneliness you feel in groups isn't random. It follows a pattern. It shows up most strongly in environments where emotional performance is expected, where connection is expressed loudly, where closeness is measured by how much people reveal, joke, bond, or align in public. And strangely, it shows up less when you're one-on-one, or in silence, or in shared presence without pressure. That contradiction matters because it tells you something important about what's really happening. You're not withdrawing from people. You're withdrawing from emotional noise. From spaces where feelings are exchanged quickly, casually, without depth or care. From environments where emotional expression is abundant, but emotional understanding is shallow. And somewhere along the way, you learn that being fully open in those spaces costs more than it gives. This isn't something you decided. It's something your system figured out before your mind ever caught up. You learn that groups often reward sameness, speed, and surface-level harmony. But your internal world doesn't move that way. You process slowly, deeply, layer by layer. By the time you understand what you're feeling, the conversation has already moved on. So instead of constantly lagging behind, you adapted. You learned to stay just far enough back to observe without being overwhelmed, to engage without dissolving into the group's emotional current. And that distance became protection. Here's the part most people misunderstand. They think feeling lonely in groups means you need more connection, more friends, more engagement, more effort. But that advice feels wrong to you because when you've tried to push yourself into fuller participation, it hasn't reduced the loneliness. It's intensified it because the problem was never lack of contact. It was lack of resonance. You don't feel lonely because no one is there. You feel lonely because you don't feel mirrored. And mirroring for you isn't about shared interests or constant interaction. It's about being met at the level you experience life. That's rare in groups. Groups move fast. They skim. They simplify. You don't. So you learn to compartmentalize, to bring your lighter self into public spaces and keep your deeper self protected. That split is subtle, but it's costly because every time you do it, a part of you stays behind, not rejected, just uninvited. And over time, that creates the sensation that you're never fully present anywhere. This is where the psychological shift happens. The loneliness you feel isn't telling you that you're failing socially. It's signaling that your system values depth over density, that it prioritizes emotional accuracy over emotional availability. You weren't built to distribute yourself across many connections. You were built to connect precisely, intentionally, which means that groups by their nature will always feel slightly misaligned, not because something is wrong with you, but because your internal calibration is different. Here's the unsettling part. The more emotionally perceptive someone is, the more selective their nervous engagement becomes. You feel everything, subtle shifts, unspoken tensions, micro-rejections, performative warmth. So your system learned to conserve, to limit exposure, to stay alert without being absorbed. What looks like detachment is actually discernment. What feels like loneliness is often clarity without companionship, and clarity, especially early on, can feel isolating. Because once you see the difference between connection and closeness, it's hard to unsee it. You start noticing how often people bond to avoid being alone rather than to truly meet each other. you see how much socializing is about distraction. About filling silence, about avoiding internal space. And that's where the separation deepens, not because you think you're better, but because you can't unfeel what you feel. So you choose distance where others choose immersion, not as rejection, as self-preservation. This doesn't mean you're meant to be alone forever. It means your capacity for connection is incompatible with constant group engagement. You need fewer, quieter, more intentional connections. You need space where silence isn't awkward, where depth isn't rushed, where presence doesn't require performance. And until those spaces exist, your system will continue to pull you slightly out of groups, not to punish you, to protect you. Here's the final truth most people never reach. The loneliness you feel in groups is not a flaw. It's a signal that you were never meant to belong everywhere. You were meant to belong precisely. And that kind of belonging doesn't happen often, which means you may spend long periods feeling out of place before you find it. That can feel unfair, heavy. But it also means that when connection does happen, it won't feel loud. It will feel grounding, quiet, like something inside you finally unclenched. Until then, the loneliness remains, not as an enemy, as a reminder that you are not missing people. You are waiting for depth. And waiting for someone like you has always been part of the design.